Hey guys, hello. Welcome to Velotio Tech Shorts. My name is Monish Karwal. I am a software engineer here at Velotio. Today we'll be talking about modern TypeSafe APIs. So here we go. We'll be looking at some API technologies and compare their benefits and see which one is better. So we have three API technologies which are commonly used. The first one is the REST API. The second one is the GraphQL, and the third one, with newly introduced one, is the tRPC. This tRPC is an extension of RPC model. All right. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the REST API. So here we see the advantages of REST API. First one is it has very easy learning curve. You can easily develop APIs using REST API. It kind of basically you're dealing with JSON responses, and this is relatively easy to create, manipulate, and consume. It is popular and mature. You have a lot of examples and a lot of extensions to REST API, and it is pretty much uh, evolved over the years, and it is relatively easy to use. It supports caching, which definitely boosts the performance, and it makes the performance better, and you have uh, an edge over the other technologies. You have to take some further steps to achieve this caching behavior in the counter, like if you work on the counterparts. It has enhanced ecosystem and rich library support. All right, so let's talk about the disadvantages of REST API. So one of the major disadvantage of REST API is it is stateless. So there is no direct communication between your server and your uh, client. It has the issue of overfetching and underfetching. Suppose you require a very specific data, which is either the user has activated his account or not. In this case, like when working with REST API, you have to fetch the user details first, and after fetching the user details, you have to find its ID and then fetch the relevant data. So in this case, a number of API calls are made, and this has the this is the underfetching and overfetching issues. So let's talk about some other disadvantages also. So and while working with REST API, you have multiple endpoints, and each of your CRUD operation requires endpoint. And as your application grows, the number of endpoints also increases, which adds additional uh, task of maintaining those APIs and then documenting them and then sharing them across. So yeah, one other disadvantage of REST API is that it has difficulty with handling complex data, which is handling nested data and all those things. Yeah. And usually the payload size in REST API is huge. So yeah, that is one problem. So let's look at some of the important applications of REST API and where it should be used. So since REST API is highly standardized, it is better if we use it for public facing APIs where the number of clients that will be using your API is huge. In that case, since it is standardized, it is easy for the clients to adapt. REST API is very easy to implement and easy to adapt. That's why it is very good for creating simple applications, and it is intuitive as well. So that is another edge which REST API has on other counterparts. So yeah, these are some of the things where you should use REST. So yeah, let's move ahead. All right, let's talk about GraphQL. So GraphQL is a query language. Basically, it exposes your data in form of query. And based on that, here are some of the advantages and disadvantages the GraphQL has. So the first advantage is it is language agnostic. It does not depend on the language. It has its own schema definition language. Basically, you'll be dealing with the graph language, which will be used to create your GraphQL UI. One of the best feature of GraphQL is it has a single endpoint. For each API call, you just have to use a single endpoint. It is strongly typed, so that's why you get the type safety. But to achieve type safety on your GraphQL API, you have to go through another layer of code generation. So let's consider a scenario wherein your server has set of GraphQL APIs, and you need to deliver those APIs to the client. In order to achieve type safety on client, you'll have to take your server GraphQL schema, convert it using 4gen, and then pass it along to the client. So yeah, this is one of the thing wherein if you require type safety on your client using GraphQL, you have that additional step of code gen. Yeah, it has better performance since it solves the under and overfetching problem. So in GraphQL, you directly fetch the exact data which you require in form of queries. So yeah, so they created GraphQL wherein they could specifically point to which data they required and fetch the exact data they wanted. Let's talk about the disadvantages of GraphQL. So here, the GraphQL does not support caching by default. In order to achieve caching, you have to add another layer over your API. So this adds to the complexity. Error handling is very difficult in GraphQL. You have to go through some patterns and then have to develop your own error handling. Also, there is a steep learning curve while working on GraphQL. You cannot use it rapidly. So yeah, you have to spend some time going through all these the nitty-gritties of GraphQL, and then you are able to go start with GraphQL. So yeah, sometimes the complex queries, you have to deal with complex queries, which can add over the disadvantages. And it does not support file upload by default. Here you have to add another layer or some library to support this. Yeah, let's look at some of the examples where GraphQL flourishes over the other counterparts. As I said, the GraphQL is used to fetch very specific data, and it solves the problem of underfetching and overfetching. So in this case, it is suitable for bandwidth sensitive platforms such as IoT devices or smartphone, where the data is limited. GraphQL is also best in applications where nested data needs to be fetched. GraphQL can also be used as a wrapper over multiple data sources. Yeah, GraphQL is also excellent for querying database with many records. In this case, you eliminate the overfetching with GraphQL and only fetch the data which is required. Yeah, so this will definitely increase your application performance and save bandwidth. All right, let's talk about what is tRPC. So tRPC is an extension of remote procedure call. tRPC is basically exposing your backend capabilities using procedure calls. Yeah. So one thing to note is tRPC is not a schema. It is method or protocol for exposing your backend functionalities to your frontend. tRPC tries to strip down all the complexities of defining data as a graph and provide simplest possible way for calling your backend from your frontend. So if we compare tRPC with GraphQL, when working with GraphQL, you have to define all your data in form of graph. But in tRPC, this complexity is not required, since you can easily expose your data in simple procedure calls. Let's talk about some features of tRPC. So it has automatic type safety and it is fully type safe. So once you deal with TypeScript, you can consume the type safety of your server on your client. So this is one of the benefit of tRPC, and it is instantly reflected on the client. There is no compilation required. Yeah, it has best developer experience since there is no code generation, runtime load, or build pipeline. So yeah, it is lightweight. It has zero dependencies. It is framework agnostic, and it is easy to add to your existing projects. So it is a simple plug and play library. It has rich support for modern libraries, and it has request patching inbuilt so that multiple requests can be combined into one easily. Let's look at why tRPC is better than GraphQL. tRPC is a lot simpler and couples your server with your web app more tightly. It makes it easy to move quickly and do changes without updating the schema, and there is no thinking about the data as a graph. Since you don't have to worry about graph, it is quite easy to work with, and you can rapidly prototype changes and then deploy them. So GraphQL, on the other hand, has a lot of processes to get things to work. You have to define your schema, and then you have to consume those schemas, and then it has to satisfy the property of a graph. So yeah, as compared to GraphQL, tRPC is quite easy. And GraphQL also requires a lot of complex tooling and added layers, such as added layer of caching, added layer of code gen, and all those things. So this is why tRPC is quite easy. And tRPC is also better performant than GraphQL. So let's look at some easy steps to get started with tRPC. So tRPC is all about defining your procedures, and those procedures can be consumed on your client side. So what procedures are? Like, procedures can be queries, mutations, or subscriptions. And those queries, mutations, and subscriptions can be contained within a router. Okay. And typically you use Zord validator, which is a library to define your schemas and have type safety automatically injected in your procedures. And let's look at the code sample to see. So here we initiate the tRPC, then we create a router, and we have a public procedure. Okay. And then we expose this public procedure in form of greeting and add it to our router. Now, simply this router is injected into any existing HTTP framework such as Express. And then at the very end, it is important to expose the type of the router. So yeah, this is important step because we need to consume this type in our client side, and this type is responsible for adding the type safety on the client side. Now, as I said, we'll need to inject the router in the HTTP framework. Also, one major thing to notice, tRPC is compatible with a lot of things such as Next.js Express, the simple fetch API, Fastify, AWS Lambda, or a vanilla Node.js HTTP server. So let's look at the step 3. Step 3 is consuming and start querying your tRPC procedures. So yeah, so this is how you link your or initiate your tRPC on your client side. And then once you have the tRPC instance, you can simply use the procedures and call and query your data. So let's talk about when you should use tRPC and when you should not use tRPC. So tRPC has better performance than REST API. And in case you want to increase your performance, tRPC could be used to increase your performance. It has full stack type safety, which is you have type safety on your server as well as client. And RPC, since it has better performance, is well for real-time streaming communication that requires lightweight and efficient messaging communication. So RPC is best. Thank you for listening to this.